This webcast looks at the question of what happened after the revolution. What happened with the establishment of the new government? And so we begin right at the end of the revolution in 1783, and we sort of ask ourselves the question, okay, now what? Now what are we going to do? Right away, the government is going to have to figure out a way to run itself. The initial articles that established the government are called the Articles of Confederation, and they have all kinds of problems. They don't have a strong central government. They don't want a king. They don't give the central government the power to tax, the power to regulate commerce. There's issues with representation because the small states the big states feel like the small states have too much power because everyone has one vote. So changing the Articles of Confederation is virtually impossible. There's a lot of issues, and on this slide you see an example. Here's a listing of some of those problems. And so they decide that they're going to come together and address the various problems of the Articles of Confederation. This happens after a meeting that's called the Albany Congress. Specifically, it happens actually after sort of a revolutionary moment known as Shays' Rebellion, where a group of farmers in western Massachusetts decide that they're not going to pay taxes anymore. And there's no army to put down that rebellion. And so folks who, essentially rich folks, the major leadership in the colonies, look at themselves and they say, wait a second, if this can happen in western Massachusetts with Daniel Shays tearing up tax records, then it can happen in the rest of the colonies. So we better come together and create a stronger central government so that we don't find ourselves in the same situation that Massachusetts had found itself in after Shays' Rebellion. Eventually Shays' Rebellion was put down in Massachusetts. But that really is what kind of sent the various delegates scrambling to meet at what comes to be known as the Philadelphia Convention or the Constitutional Convention. So in 1787, they meet in Philadelphia, and the idea, at least initially, is to amend or to change the Articles of Confederation to make sort of a stronger central government. Now, it quickly becomes clear that the Articles of Confederation are so messed up that they need to begin again. And so they begin essentially arguing. And we can think of that as sort of a series of different problems that kind of emerge over the course of their discussions. Now, to paint the scene, you have a group of guys, and they're all guys, the various different high-level representatives from all the colonies. They meet together in Philadelphia. They literally close the windows. They close the windows. They put drapes around the shades. It's hot, and they begin discussing. And the first big question is distribution of power, federal versus states. And this debate of federal versus state power is one that we actually still struggle with in some ways today. The solution that they come up with is that the states are going to retain sort of pretty much all of the powers that aren't stated in the Constitution, but that the federal will ultimately be supreme in terms of being kind of the law of the land. So the federal system is going to make decisions with regard to the Constitution, and the states will make decisions basically about everything else. If you look at, let me pull up this Venn diagram. Here you can kind of see a distinction between those national powers versus those state powers. So states have lots of power. I mean, when you think about your own life, what do the states control? Well, they make decisions about the speed limit. They make decisions about everything from gay marriage to whether or not marijuana is legal. Those depend, they go state by state. There's federal law that deals with these things to a certain degree, but ultimately those are state decisions. If you're in Montana, you can drive 80 miles an hour. If you're in Ohio, you better not go faster than 55 miles an hour. If you're in the state of Colorado, marijuana is legal to smoke recreationally. If you're in Virginia, you better not do that because you're going to jail. Nationally, the only one who can declare war, that is the federal government, only the federal government can declare war. So, you can kind of see there's things that happen on the state level, there's things that happen on the federal level, and then there's things that happen on both levels, like taxing. Taxing is a big one. All right, second problem. The second major problem had to do with representation. How are we going to solve this issue of representation? It had lingered through the Articles of Confederation. The people of states like Virginia felt like they were being cheated because Virginia or Massachusetts, these were huge states, and then you had tiny Rhode Island or Delaware or New Jersey, which didn't have a very large population, and so the people in Virginia felt like their votes were sort of not being counted for quite as much. So what they come up with is called the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise creates two legislative bodies, the Senate and the House of Representatives, or what we refer to as the upper and the lower house. The Senate would have 2 representatives per state, whereas the lower house would be based on population. So, for example, today, when we look at the lower house, we can say, and let me see if I can pull it up here for just a second. Give me a minute. And I'll pull up this chart. There you can see it. You can see Texas has 36 representatives today. Florida, 27 representatives. California, a whopping 53 representatives, whereby Montana has 1 representative. South Dakota, 1 representative. Virginia, we have 11 representatives. So depending upon the size of the state's population, you're going to have more or less representatives in the House of Representatives. Once representation was based on population, then the question became, well, what about slaves? Should we count slaves as people for the purposes of representation? Naturally, the southern states wanted to count them because they had lots of slaves, and that would make their population larger, which in turn would make their representation larger in Congress. What they come up with is known as the 3/5 compromise. So for every 10 slaves, that counts as 6 for your population tally, if you will. This was sort of again, it was a compromise. It was a way to keep the South happy, but also sort of, recognize that, in fact, the Southerners didn't really treat their slaves as humans. They more really sort of looked at their slaves as more like, almost like farm animals. Now, the biggest question was ultimately the question of the overall structure of the government. What is it going to look like? And this is where we turn to a guy by the name of James Madison, also referred to as the father of the Constitution. He comes to the Constitution Convention in Philadelphia with a plan in his pocket, what we call the Virginia Plan, because Madison was from Virginia. His idea is to create 3 branches of government, a legislative, an executive, and a judicial branch. This is exactly the form of government that we have today. The idea was to create a sense of sort of checks and balances so that different branches could check and sort of balance one another. Now, initially, his idea was to make the legislative branch purely based on population, which would have given Virginia, that was a very large state, a lot of power. The smaller states didn't like this idea, which is where we come up with the Great Compromise, and so the legislative branch itself kind of gets divided in half with the Congress and the Senate. Largely put, though, the Virginia Plan does become Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the U.S. Constitution. That's why we call James Madison the father of the Constitution. Visually, the 3 branches of government look a little bit like this. You've got the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Now, I like to say that they check each other, kind of like a hockey check. Here we have a hockey check. In reality, when we talk about the checks and balances, right, just like checking someone on a hockey rink, the executive branch can check the legislative branch by vetoing their bills. The legislative branch can check the executive branch by ultimately maybe even impeaching the president, or if the executive branch vetoes a legislative branch law and the legislative branch wants to override that veto, they can do so with a 2/3 majority. And this goes back and forth, kind of like on a hockey rink, so that these people are checking each other.
I have to celebrate you.
And the idea on a hockey rink is, they put them up against the wall to make sure that they're kind of keeping them in line. And that was the exact same idea. It's got basically one branch is going to check another branch. Boom. And make sure that they stay in line. Now, just because I think it's interesting, I wanted to quickly show you some visuals of the different people who actually represent you. I mean, this is Tim Kaine. He's one of the 2 senators from Virginia who currently is a senator. This is Congressman Moran. He's in the House of Representatives for the district that students at Edison High School go to. Tim Kaine again. This is the local government. So this is our Board of Supervisors. You can kind of see who the people are. Or if I scroll down a little bit and I go to Lee District, Jeffrey McKay is currently our local representative. So he's the one who represents us locally in government. Okay, next time we'll talk a little bit more about how the debate over the Articles of Confederation, over the Constitution then played out.